They called my name at the DMV just as the vet beside me dropped his medals. One had a bullet nick. Name's Joey 12, unofficial grandson, and full-time sketcher of stories no one asks to hear. The heating unit buzzed, smelled like burnt coffee, and I clutched the folded napkin he never left behind. Ever seen a salute freeze a room without a word? Tell me what you'd have done if you were there. People walked past him like he was a coat rack. But the man in the brown jacket stood tall with a kind of quiet gravity only time can give. The wind whipped lightly along Main Street, scattering yellow oak leaves onto the wide granite steps of the county courthouse. Tuesday mornings in Franklin Springs always smelled faintly of coffee and wood smoke, and today was no different. Across the street, Penny's Diner pulsed with a soft golden light, the windows fogged slightly from the warmth inside. Frank Malloy set his empty paper cup on the edge of a trash can, adjusted the folder under his arm, and gave Harold the janitor sweeping near the doors a slow, silent nod. Harold paused just a second, his eyes flickering to the folded American flag tucked under Frank's elbow. Recognition sparked, but he said nothing, turning back to his broom as if that fleeting moment hadn't happened. Joey bounced lightly beside him, sketchpad clutched against his chest like a shield. His sneakers squeaked as they crossed the lobby tile. The boy's eyes darted everywhere at the peeling paint near the ceiling vents, the flickering fluorescent light near the hallway, the frayed corner of the front mat. He didn't speak, but his fingers itched with lines he'd draw later. Inside the courthouse lobby was stuffy with old heat. A dozen people crowded benches along the wall, shifting in their seats or staring into phones. A middle-aged man in a neon HVAC uniform sighed heavily with each tap of his pen. Frank waited patiently at the check-in counter. Rachel Whitmore, the court clerk, didn't look up. "Form A9 for housing transition," Frank said, gently, voice low and worn smooth like an old hymn. Rachel slid a clipboard across the counter without glancing up. "Fill this out, sir. Walk-ins will be called in order." She returned to her screen, scrolling rapidly. Joey frowned. "We had an appointment at 9. Rachel's typing didn't pause. "Walk-ins only today." Frank took the clipboard without complaint. They found 2 empty seats across from a vending machine humming louder than necessary. As soon as they sat, an elderly woman leaned in beside Frank to ask what time it was, then pulled back when he turned, mumbling, "Never mind." Frank adjusted his folder on his lap. The thick manila edges stuck out slightly, revealing official seals, faded notations, and a gleam of bronze pinned to the corner just visible if one happened to look. No one looked. Joey reached into his jacket and pulled out a stubby pencil. He turned to a blank page and began sketching. Without needing reference, a soldier crouched, one arm shielding another, blood smeared on the sleeve. His pencil moved fast, but his eyes were still. Watching. Thinking. Across the room, a woman stood to leave, and Joey sprang up to offer her the seat. She stared past him like glass brushing by without thanks. He sat again, chewing the inside of his cheek. "Grandpa," he whispered, "they don't see you." Frank gave a faint shrug. "That's all right." His hands moved slowly as he filled the form pen steady despite the arthritis that had crept in over the years. His cursive was neat, deliberate. When he finished, he stood and walked back to the desk. Rachel barely glanced at the form. "You left the case number blank." "I wasn't given one," Frank said. Rachel sighed, typing something fast. "You're not in the system. You're marked as a walk-in." Frank opened his folder, carefully revealing a stapled packet with the housing authority's letterhead bearing the correct date and time. "I had this scheduled," he said quietly. Rachel looked at it for a split second before sliding it aside. "It's been processed as walk-in. I'll put you on the list." Frank returned to his seat slower this time. Joey handed him the sketch, tapping the pencil on the soldier's eyes. "Doesn't this look like you?" Frank chuckled softly. "Maybe younger. And skinnier." A young man in a gray hoodie leaned over to look. "Nice drawing, kid." Then he turned away before Joey could answer. The silence settled again. The hours crawled, People came and went, names were called. Rachel eventually stood clipboard in hand. "Sir, do you need assistance with the forms?" Her voice was loud, impersonal. She didn't look at him. Frank blinked. "I've already filled them out." A woman a few seats down leaned in to the man beside her and whispered not quietly, "They should have a separate line for people like that." Joey froze. Frank's hands rested calmly on his lap. He didn't flinch. Joey leaned closer, whispering so only Frank could hear. "Do they even know who you are?" The line moved slowly. So did time. But Frank had waited through worse winters than this one. Outside, the sun climbed no higher than the courthouse's second-floor ledge. Inside, the warmth came in stutters. A wheezing radiator near the stairwell groaned like an old dog dreaming. The smell of burnt coffee drifted from a half-empty pot in the corner. Above, fluorescent bulbs buzzed with the faint electric exhaustion of a place that had lived the same day for decades. Frank and Joey had moved no more than 6 feet since the morning. The bench they sat on creaked when either of them shifted. Joey's sketchbook rested on his lap, thumb holding a page halfway open. He glanced toward the reception counter. Rachel, eyes puffy and jaw-tight, shuffled forms with one hand and typed furiously with the other. Frank gently cleared his throat. "Ms. Whitmore, I believe we already turned this in." Rachel flipped the form, marked it with a sharp red slash, and said, without looking, "It's incomplete. No contact number." "I don't own a phone," Frank said. She paused for only half a beat. Still incomplete. She tossed it into the adjacent tray. Frank nodded once. "Thank you," he said, voice steady as if she'd just handed him a birthday card. He turned and returned to his seat, not noticing the way Harold, still sweeping at the edge of the hallway, paused for a moment. Joey muttered, "That wasn't right." Frank sat down slowly, his bones clicking into the bench like puzzle pieces. "She's just tired. People have off days." Joey didn't look up. He flipped his sketchbook open and thumbed to a worn page labeled Da Nang. Pencil lines etched a moment far from Pennsylvania, a Marine hauling another across muddy terrain, shoulders, tense face drawn tight against pain and smoke. Did they really carry each other like this? Joey asked. Frank leaned forward, eyes scanning the image like it might move. Sometimes, he said softly. Other times, you just dragged him by the collar and prayed you didn't get hit. Joey stared at his grandfather, blinking. "Your classmates say anything again?" Frank asked, changing the subject. Joey hesitated. "They think I hang out with a homeless man." He looked up quickly. "I told them you weren't. That you were mine." Frank chuckled, a deep, dry sound like boots on gravel. "This jacket's older than their teacher. Let 'em wonder." Joey smiled, but it faded when a woman pushed past their knees without so much as a glance. The hallway buzzed louder. Someone dropped a pen. Another person sighed dramatically. Frank reached into his coat and pulled out a paper towel-wrapped bundle. "Banana bread?" Joey asked. Frank shook his head. "You first. You brought it." "I brought it for you," Joey said. "I already had cereal." The two sat in silence again. Harold shuffled by, slow and steady. He didn't speak, but as he passed, he bent down and placed a folded napkin on the floor beside Frank's foot. He kept walking, pretending it wasn't deliberate. Joey saw it, said nothing, just smiled a little. Rachel called out another name, someone younger, brisker, with earbuds in and shoes that clicked fast on linoleum. Frank didn't flinch. He pulled out his folder again and began reviewing the documents, checking each signature as if it might vanish if he didn't watch closely. A soft thud echoed as something slipped from the edge. Frank leaned to catch it. The folder opened mid-air, scattering a thin stack of medals across the floor. One of them, silver circular, edged with a sunburst, had a jagged notch through its center. A bullet had once found its edge. No one moved. Joey dropped to the ground and started picking them up gently one by one like lifting feathers from a battlefield. The bronze stars, the ribboned hearts, the notched one last. Rachel looked up from her screen, then back down. "I can't keep track of every vet story today," she mumbled. Joey said nothing. He handed the medals back to Frank, placing them in the folder with quiet care. Frank nodded once, touched Joey's shoulder, and sat back with the folder cradled in his arms like something living. The door to the courthouse creaked open. Bootsteps sounded measured, deliberate deep. Frank didn't turn, but Joey looked up and leaned closer to his grandfather, eyes wide. "That's a general," he whispered. It wasn't on the schedule. It wasn't loud. But it was the only thing anyone remembered that day. Just past 11, the light changed. Not outside, the sky remained a bleached November gray, but within the courthouse where the windows suddenly sharpened every shadow. The line had begun to settle into a rhythm of frustrated sighs and boot taps, paperwork, shuffles, and low murmurs. A child whined near the exit. Rachel's printer whirred and jammed again. No one noticed the door swing open. Not at first. Joey did. He glanced up and caught a gleam, metal catching sunlight in a way that didn't belong in a place with buzzing lights and stale air. His fingers flipped quickly to a blank page in his sketchbook, the corner labeled in soft pencil, "Page 47, hold." He didn't know what he was about to see, only that it mattered. A man in full dress uniform stepped through the threshold. His steps didn't echo, they measured the floor, claimed it. General Alvin Hargrave had a frame that commanded space without asking permission. He wore no medals across his chest, no fanfare beyond the pristine line of buttons, and the quiet gravity that clung to his every motion. Rachel looked up and froze. Her fingers hovered mid-gesture above a manila folder. Harold, still by the far wall, stopped sweeping. He didn't move, just let the handle of the broom lean gently against the crook of his arm. The general's eyes moved across the hall, not scanning, searching. Then he saw Frank. Frank, still seated, folder back on his lap, thumbing the edge of a veteran's benefits letter as if he'd read it 100 times. He hadn't seen the man enter. The general walked forward, cutting a path through the line without speaking. No one stepped in his way. No one dared. A young woman at the front clutched her purse a little closer and turned to watch. Joey's pencil touched the page. General Hargrave stopped 3 feet in front of Frank. There was no announcement, no preamble, just silence. And then he saluted, a full regulation salute. Elbow-sharp hand, crisp, eyes locked not on Frank's face but something deeper, something only men who had buried parts of themselves could see. Frank looked up, and for a moment it was as if the courthouse tilted on its axis. He saw the stars on the shoulder boards, the press of the collar, the nameplate. And then he saw the eyes. Recognition didn't come fast, it came like a sunrise. Slow, certain. Frank stood, slowly, painfully, without complaint. His knees cracked and Joey reached to steady him, but Frank waved him off gently. He rose, squared his shoulders, and raised a trembling hand to his brow. The return salute wasn't textbook. It was older than that. It came from a place the manual didn't cover. Rachel dropped her pen. The clatter of it rang down the hallway like a cracked bell. No one flinched. Harold nodded, slow and solemn, as if confirming something he'd always known but never spoken. And then, as if speaking aloud would cheapen the moment, the general said only one thing. "He's the reason I'm standing." He lowered his hand, turned on his heel, and walked back toward the door. His boots didn't squeak. They didn't echo. But somehow they left a mark deeper than scuff. Joey's hand flew across the page, capturing the slight bend of Frank's arm. The tilt of his chin, the line between reverence and surprise carved into the soft folds of his grandfather's face. No one said a word. Not Rachel, whose eyes filled, but lips stayed closed. Not the line of townsfolk, now silent and watching. Not even Frank, who simply sat down again, folder pressed once more to his chest like something sacred. At the front of the line, a teenager with a backwards cap tapped quickly on his phone. "Something huge just happened here," he wrote. The paper smelled like old boxes and rain, but its words were clear as the silence in that courtroom. The late afternoon sun pressed long shadows against the courthouse walls. In the back office, where fluorescent light gave up by midday, Rachel sat alone, sleeves rolled to her elbows, glasses low on her nose. Her desk was scattered with forms, paper clips, and a ceramic mug that once said, "Legal Eagle," now chipped and faded to Eagle. The courthouse was quieter now. The long line had dissolved into the hum of distant typewriters and the murmur of Penny's diner through the thin glass window behind her. Frank's file sat before her. She hadn't meant to linger on it. There were stacks of other cases waiting, permit disputes, parking fines, a marriage license request from 2 high school sweethearts who insisted on marrying before the snow. But her eyes kept drifting back to the folder with the creased corner and soft pencil handwriting, Malloy F. She opened it again. The name near the top of the page read, Chaplain Harold Jameson. It meant nothing to her until she realized she'd passed that name 3 times without questioning it. She scanned downward, noting the careful script, then paused at the bulge between 2 pages. An envelope. She hadn't seen it earlier. It was marked in faded black ink, 2006, private. No return address. The flap was sealed only with time, not glue. She hesitated, then slid her finger under the flap. The letter inside was handwritten, its script deliberate and strong. The kind of handwriting people used when they expected to be read once and remembered forever. Dear Frank, you carried me 6 miles through enemy fire. I've never told anyone that. They said I wouldn't walk again. You made sure I did, that I wouldn't see home. You made sure I did. You didn't have to. You already had your orders. But you looked at me like I mattered, even when I didn't think I did. Rachel stopped reading. She set the letter down gently as though any sudden motion might undo its words. Her fingers hovered over the page. She reached for her laptop, then paused. Lips parted, unsure why she was reaching at all. The letter wasn't meant for typing. A napkin fluttered loose from between the papers. On it, in looping pencil, were words that didn't belong in a bureaucrat's file. He doesn't like noise, but he always listens. Joey's handwriting awkward earnest. Like he had written it with the full weight of his small shoulders. Rachel swallowed. Her own grandfather had served. Korea. She barely knew more than the uniform in the attic and the word bugle. He'd passed before she asked anything, before she'd thought to care. A black and white photo slid loose from the folder's spine. Young Frank. Maybe mid-30s. Medals at his chest, smile lined with humility. One arm around a younger version of the man who had saluted him hours earlier. General Hargrave. Hair still thick. Youthful jaw clenched with something like gratitude or maybe disbelief. The photo wasn't staged. It was a moment caught candid and impossible. Rachel leaned back in her chair. The courthouse clock ticked softly in the background. Somewhere outside, Harold pushed a trash bin down the ramp, the wheel squeaking with every third rotation. She didn't call out to him. She didn't reach for the phone either. Instead, she reached for her own notepad, one with soft yellow pages she usually saved for depositions. She pulled a pen from behind her ear, flattened the page with both hands, and began to write. Not with the mechanical clicks of her keyboard, but by hand. There was no line at Penny's that morning, just a seat waiting for Frank and a cup already poured. The diner's windows wore a soft glaze of drizzle, the kind that blurred traffic and quieted the town. Franklin Springs moved slower on rainy days. People spoke in lower tones. Footsteps softened under damp shoes. And at Penny's diner, where the booths wore the same red vinyl they had in '79, the morning felt stitched together with coffee steam and familiar silence. Frank Malloy sat by the window. The table had already been wiped down. A small saucer cradled a folded napkin and a steaming cup of black decaf. No sugar, no cream. Just the way he always ordered it but hadn't needed to say a word this time. Marge slid into view from behind the counter, pencil tucked behind one ear. "Coffee's on the house, Frank," she said, voice brisk but not hurried. "Courtesy of management." Frank looked up, startled, not by the words, but by the way she'd said his name. Like it belonged. He touched the brim of his cap lightly, a nod more grateful than polite. Joey was beside him, curled into the booth with his sketchbook sprawled over his lap. He was halfway through a plate of pumpkin pancake syrup pooling on the side where the butter had melted unevenly. His pencil danced across the page between bites. The bell above the door chimed softly. Rachel stepped in her coat damp around the edges. She paused as if waiting for permission the room didn't need to give, then walked to their table. "May I?" she asked. Frank didn't say anything, just gestured to the empty seat across from him with 2 fingers and a lift of the brow. She sat. The radio in the background spun out an old country tune, Billy Ray Cyrus's "Some Gave All" so faint it sounded like memory more than music. Rachel placed a single envelope on the table. Not manila, not bureaucratic, just white paper, crisp edges. The front bore Frank's name in her handwriting, steady and deliberate. Inside a letter. Joey watched as Frank unfolded it with the same care he gave to his medals. At the top, in bold ink, "Preferred guest, line B." Frank read it twice before folding it once clean down the center and sliding it back into the envelope. Joey nudged something across the table next. A torn piece of sketch pad, edges frayed but centered with a drawing so alive it felt like film. Frank and General Hargrave mid-salute. The lines around Frank's eyes were drawn deep and Hargrave's posture straight. Reverence spoke louder than words. Even the background held silhouettes of townsfolk frozen mid-breath. Rachel studied it. Her jaw flexed once before she let out a long breath. "I've got toast and jam coming," she murmured. "Figured I'd earn my seat." Joey grinned and waved to Marge, who already had the plate in hand. Frank said nothing for a while. His fingers tapped gently against the base of the coffee cup. Outside, the drizzle thickened, painting the sidewalk silver. The flag, carefully folded and placed beside his saucer, caught the warm light of the diner like a whisper from another world. He leaned back slightly, gaze drifting out the window. "Guess I'll keep showing up," he said softly, "if only for the view." Rachel's toast arrived. Joey reached over and stole a corner without asking. She didn't scold him. The silence at the table wasn't empty. It was earned. Rachel glanced up once more and asked, "Will you be at the park on Friday?" Frank didn't answer. He just tipped his cup. The parade wasn't big, just a line of memories and a few good boots, still polished, still proud. The city park smelled like leaves and cinnamon. Flags heavy with morning frost hung at half-mast, and the crisp November air cut through coats with the kind of sting that made everyone stand straighter. Veterans Day in Franklin Springs wasn't flashy. No brass bands, no floats. Just folding chairs in rows, cider warming in plastic jugs near a tent, and the rustle of paper programs held by hands that remembered more than they'd ever say. Frank arrived before the crowd. He moved slowly across the damp grass, his field coat zipped high, the brim of his cap shadowing his eyes. He sat alone near the back second row from the end where the sun barely reached through the bare branches. His flag stayed tucked under one arm. He rested it on his lap now, not like a burden, more like a quiet anchor. Joey found him just after the chairs had filled. The boy's cheeks were flushed from the cold, his sketchbook peeking from his coat pocket like it might leap out and start drawing on its own. He tugged gently on Frank's sleeve. "You should be up there," he said, nodding toward the front. Frank followed the direction with a slow glance. Reserved seats, names on laminated cards. Rachel stood nearby, a scarf knotted neatly at her neck, her fingers wrapped around a styrofoam cup of cider. She caught Frank's eye, lifted her chin, and motioned toward the empty seat beside her. He hesitated, then stood. They walked together, Joey beside him, hands jammed deep into his coat. The crowd noticed, not all at once, but in waves. Heads turned. Hats were tugged lower. A few people whispered names. One or two even stepped aside without knowing why. Rachel stepped forward to meet them. She didn't say a word, just touched Frank's shoulder as he passed her fingers, lingering a moment longer than polite. He took the seat beside her. From the corner of his eye, Frank spotted a familiar face near the cider tent. General Hargrave. No uniform today. Just a wool coat and slacks, his silver hair brushed neatly back. He didn't approach, just nodded once, deep deliberate. Frank nodded back. The program began. Names read in a solemn cadence. Stories not told, just acknowledged. Chairs creaked under old joints. Breath fogged in slow clouds. As the roll call echoed forward, Joey leaned over, borrowed Rachel's pen, and added one more name to the bottom of the sheet. He passed the slip to the reader. No fanfare, no pause. Franklin Malloy. It passed the lips like it had always been part of the list. A few people turned. One woman clapped quickly, stifled. Frank didn't shift. He just closed his eyes briefly, then opened them again as a small Cub Scout stepped shyly from the sidelines. The boy held out a handmade pin, red, white, and blue beads strung onto a safety clip, crooked but earnest. He didn't say anything, just offered it with both hands. Frank bowed as he accepted it. Not from pain, but from respect. He pinned it beneath the faded insignia on his coat and returned to his seat without a word. Cider passed from hand to hand. Pie followed on paper plates, the crust flaky and still warm. No one rushed to leave. The air had weight, but not burden. It pressed down like a blanket, not a stone. Rachel wore a small pin at her collar, the same one Frank had once kept tucked deep in his folder. The clasp still held. Harold passed through the rows with cups and napkins, his silent steps practiced. He paused briefly at Frank's row. No greeting, just a refill and a nod. As the chairs began to empty, Joey leaned toward Frank again. "Next year," he whispered, "I'll bring a sketchbook just for stories." Frank didn't speak, but he smiled and let the weight of the moment settle where it belonged. Of all the quiet moments that passed unnoticed in that small town, this one stayed like breath on a cold window, brief yet lasting. An old Marine stood a little taller, not because the world finally saw him, but because a child, a clerk, and a friend reminded him he mattered. Kindness unasked and unspoken can echo longer than medals or parades. Sometimes the gentlest truths arrive not with fanfare, but with folded flags and borrowed pens. Like a porch light left on for someone finding their way home, a small act of recognition can warm even the coldest morning.